Hi, let's talk about projection in terms of Buddhist psychology, in terms of Western psychology, and then in terms of community lab course. So I've been looking at some research recently about the process of projection with Buddhist practitioners, where still foundational early in the research is that through meditation, people's projective process becomes louder, more clear. And there may be an initial stage of people believing their projections as great insight. And then the work is to slowly dismantle those over time. There's also work being done of kind of mapping the Eastern and Western ideas of projection. But this is what I have to say about it in terms of this course. I think community lab class is a place where everyone's having their own unique experience. So coming from their own past and their own experiences, if we just said what happened 5 minutes ago, everyone would have a different take. What does that mean? Everyone would have a different take. And this is all coming from people's histories, projection, karma. So projection isn't a new idea. So let's talk about some historical roots, and then we'll work our way into community lab class. Very old in the Talmud, it says, don't taunt your neighbor for the blemish you yourself have. Plato in the allegory of the cave talks about experiences being limited and shape what is already known, and then people cannot or resist new understandings and new experiences. And then from the Bible, why do you speak of the sawdust in your brother's eye, but pay no attention to the plank in your own? So I'm sure all of you have been the subject of projective processes where people are understanding you in a way that's different than the way you understand yourself. I think about just from my childhood and my development, there was that saying, I'm rubber, you're glue. Whatever you say about me is true for you. And this is the general idea in a lot of psychology and projections, is that what is happening for us that we can't acknowledge or own, we will see that in others and place that on others as a way to sustain our self-image, our self-esteem, our kind of psychic stability, because we don't have the strength to acknowledge our shadows, so to speak. Or as a child, we say, when someone would say something to us, we'd say, I know you are, but what am I? I think in my cohort and beyond, I've often heard the phrase, if you spot it, you got it. So if you say someone is lazy, you're maybe denying the only laziness in yourself. If you're saying someone has aggressive feelings, you may be denying the aggressive feelings inside yourself. If you're saying someone else doesn't know something, you might be denying your lack of knowledge in some area yourself. So the idea is we'll review projection from a Buddhist and psychological lens. We'll talk about divergences, similarities, and then maybe some remedies about how to work with this and how this may manifest in community lab course. So prior to this idea of projection, which is putting what's inside you out onto others, out onto the world, we really have to at least make a quick note about introjection or cognitive schemas or kind of similar constructs and concepts, right? Our thoughts develop from the environment around us, right? What we think is from what we've been exposed to. Our behaviors often develop from modeling. When I say have a client degrade me or yell at me, I often think that this is them modeling and wanting me to deeply understand their experience potentially with a parental figure or a coach or something like that. Or if they're saying I'm not making sense potentially, which could be true, but I'd clarify it, but it could be something that they feel anxious about dealing with the complexity and groundlessness of it. So feeling states, relational patterns, communication styles are all learned from our experiences, and they bring us to this current moment. So there's lots of work on this. You can look at cognitive theories, thinking of Piaget. You had that class. I'm guessing you've learned a little bit about developmental neuroscience at this point. So onward and outward, introjections and schemas towards self and others, right? not only do our thoughts come out of potentially our past experience, but deeper feeling states and repetitions of feeling states or patterns of feeling states may come out from our past experiences. And this is habitualized. Depending on who you are, you may have a very small variety of feeling states. I can think of much of my work with clients is expanding their emotional range and recognizing their emotional range or being curious about their emotional range. My work is mainly in groups, so you get to see people feeling things and modeling things in a new way. So I don't want to make these too simplistic. So I think some complex examples of how our inward introjects and habituation can happen with feelings would be, it's not unusual that someone may feel shame after being criticized and then afterwards either attack the other person in a self-protective way as opposed to exploring it, although you could explore it, ask others, talk about it in therapy and decide it's not accurate, or you might quickly run to positive self-talk, or sometimes grief slips into disassociation, and a loss of focus. And then when grief emerges, we might quickly go back to either hyperfocus or disassociation because the feeling is just intolerable. This may be something we've learned. Management of grief feelings is not something most of us have learned well in our culture. So these introjections, these patterns, and these schemas really hold true for relational patterns or communication patterns. But of course, in terms of this course, how we understand social dynamics and what we think are the best or possible behaviors to follow these social dynamics as we understand them. So in Buddhist thought, the term projection isn't exactly used. There's this term Maya, which means illusions, not seeing the world accurately. There's this idea of dependent origination that our karma, our training, our past experiences meets the external world and co-creates a narrative about it and co-creates our behavior about it. I don't want to jump ahead with skandha, but this idea that we have certain schemas that will eventually go into consciousness. And is there a way to broaden that consciousness to become more aware of those schemas and potentially as part of your counselor education, even broaden those schemas in the fourth level of skandha? Don't want to go too much deeper into that. Can we be present with what is, or try to go there and try to get out of what we think is going on? What may we be missing? What may we not be understanding? And then can we bring an openness and awareness to the unfolding exchange process that's happening in the community lab class? What are we feeling? Are these our old feelings? Are these feelings other people are having? What thoughts are popping into my mind? Why might those thoughts be popping into my mind? Is there an overall feeling state that the majority of the group feels or a large subgroup feels? Is there kind of a conflict that isn't being named that we can feel and maybe find words and explore in the group? So Trump the founder of the school, talked about in The Lion's Roar. He describes emotions, particularly of desire or frustration, as fundamentally arising from our projections. Right? Oftentimes our projections come forth as judgments towards others. Emotions can also arise from what we're projecting on the environment, which may not be accurate. There may be a moment of silence in the community lab class, and it might be deepening and reflective moment for most people in the class. However, given your personal experience, you may experience silence as hostile or rejecting, right? Each person will experience each moment uniquely. People will experience silence different in this group, right? Our emotional reactions emerge because we encounter something the mind has already projected. So we engage with the world, we come up with a story, a narrative about it, and then we have our emotional kind of reactions that kind of serve to reinforce this projection. Say with the example I'm giving of silent in the group and we think that's hostile, and the next person says, I'm feeling uncomfortable, that person who thinks silence is hostile might take that as a criticism of them or as an expression of anger. Our past influences what we see in the current from many Buddhist models. Other models talk about how our kind of emotional mental state may influence what projections and what we see in the world. When I'm sad, I might see happiness in others, or I might see sadness in others. When I'm frustrated, I might see the negative in others and be judgmental. So basically, our projection from a Buddhist view is really the root of our suffering, of our clinging, of how things have to be, how things should be. These are mental defilements where we're not clear seeing, as Wagello would say. I really like Angel Kyoto Williams, came to Naropa as a Len scholar, spent a lot of time with us when I was teaching in the mindfulness program. But she emphasizes the importance of recognizing how particularly personal and collective wounds will shape our perceptions. Working a lot with racism and gender, which are projective group processes, and how we can sculpt distorted views of others from our wounds. Say potentially when I was playing football, someone who was Mormon bullied me over and over, who was on the team. I might develop a projection about Mormons. Or also what I think Angel Kyoto Williams is referring to is the narratives we get from our culture and from others that will shape how we see others, understand dynamics, right? We're all socially conditioned, and this will influence what we see in the world. Right? This is part of liberation Buddhism, where we can make meaning out of our circumstances, but we're not defined by it. Here's a quote from her that I really like. And that, again, deconstructing the dominant narratives in Radical Dharma, she asks us to constantly be looking for the remnants of patriarchal white supremacy, binary thinking, capitalistic norms, or say power, control, achievement, right? All these categories of modernity and whiteness. And instead of going to one truth, this, not that, can we hold multiple narratives? Can we lean in and understand narratives of others around us? So in Buddhism, there's a famous story about the snake and rope metaphor. Someone's walking in a dark room. They see something in the corner that's curled up. They yell, snake, danger, and everyone gets scared. But then someone goes closer and you realize it's actually just a rope. So this is classic example of what the mind does from a Buddhist perspective. Another kind of metaphor that's often used is ocean and waves, right? The ocean represents the ultimate truth, and the waves kind of individual beings or phenomena. But in our minds, we see the waves as distinct, and we don't see them as part of the flow of the ocean. So we're constantly putting things into categories, into labels, into language. This is talked about in the West, with particularly last 100 years in language, philosophy, say later Wittgenstein or Derrida or people like that, that language limits our perception of what's happening, right? Language, as Lacan would say, language thinks us. We don't think in language. So I talked a little bit about the skandhas earlier. They talk about misperceiving as a way that creates suffering also in Buddhism and Hinduism. And then individual and group karma will reinforce perceptual patterns. So as the more a group or a society puts out one narrative, the stronger that narrative gets, the harder it is to challenge and see below it and to see through its limitations. So this is found in lots of Buddhist literature, these ideas. right? From the Buddhist teaching himself, the ignorant imagine the unreal as real. His mind-only traditions where all phenomena are really just our mental projections. And then our kind of projections, our habitual overlay, often of kind of self-centered interpretations that we're seeing the world accurately. So whatever happens in the world, just we won't see what we can't see, and it will just reinforce what we already believe is happening. So through these projections, we'll have cravings for things that be different. We'll want to destroy things, or want to control things, or want to avoid things. And we really need to bring our curiosity there if possible. All these projections and language bring this idea center that there's distinct self, that things aren't impermanent, that there are distinct others or are unchanging. And that from the Buddhist perspective, this can really create aggressive behavior, acting out, and often can justify harmful actions where we're not approaching things with humility and we're not approaching things with compassion. So basically, these Maya projections perpetuate samsaric cycles. So I try to think of some examples. Someone in the cohort reminds you of someone from your past, and you start treating them that way. Cohort dynamics remind you of some dynamic in your family or another social group, and you start reacting that way and understanding it only that way. You find or only see what you already know, so your old belief about others and groups are just reinforced and not expanded. You project onto authority figures from your past onto the instructors or the administrators. You can overly simplify and stereotype along demographic variables, which would be race, gender, sexual orientation, class, appearance, onward and onward. These are the group projections where people are no longer seen in their uniqueness, but are simplified into one category with these traits in them. And this has led to horrific damage throughout the history of the world, and also in terms of one-to-one interpersonal relationships. Right? When you're within the cohort, your old perceptions create old feelings and relational patterns, and you talk over someone, or you try to convince somebody that they're wrong. And then oftentimes with this simplicity, you might look around the room, and we're always subgrouping when we're in a group, and we're saying, what group am I a part of? What group I'm not a part of? These binary Western concepts. We might break our group or cohort into friends and foes, or allies and enemies. I remember when I was leading this class, the students would come in, and on one side would be one collection of students, and on the other side would be another collection of students, and there'd just be like two students sitting there, and there'd be wide gaps. And eventually came out that two students had a romantic relationship. They had a fight, they broke up, and the cohort was choosing sides and showing their alliances by sitting on different sides of the group. So there's many co-emerging flashpoints when you're part of a community lab group or part of a training institution or training cohort. Cohort members misperceive or peers or instructions meaning. They say, I want you to feel free to speak in here. And people might interpret that as they can say the most aggressive, demeaning thing possible. What we're trying to communicate and what people hear, it's amazing we get along at all. Right? Cohort members may misperceive a peers or instructor's intent. Say an instructor is silent or called, that they might think that the instructor is mad or sick of the group or doesn't know what they're doing, where oftentimes silence is the best intervention you can use. Or potentially someone feels sad and people perceive it's about them, overly personalize it. So you can really be aware of what occurs in your mind in community lab class. And generally speaking, if you can say, I feel, I don't know if this is true, I wonder if, can anyone help me understand this? Or I feel bad, this kind of cultural scripts coming into my mind. If you can take ownership of your experience with vulnerability. It might help others to do that, and it may help the whole group move towards a deeper understanding of what's going on and how to move forward. Projection is pre-psychology, although they often attribute it to Freud, but I don't know if Freud got many of it. He even says, right, it was Sophocles and Dostoevsky that in Shakespeare that were his primary teachers, and I would say Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, very much a European Western model. But it's found in other schools of thought beyond psychoanalysis. Neuroscience continues to show these deep neural pathways that get grooved in our default network, and we don't see other possibilities. We only see what we've already seen. We may want, if we're feeling uncomfortable or confused, we may want to quickly put a narrative or meaning on that as a defense mechanism. Oftentimes, we will project onto others what is distasteful that we may be feeling. I like this idea that when someone tells you something about yourself, it might be accurate, but more likely than not, it's a confession of some type. So this is found, as we've seen, across theoretical schools in Buddhism and in other spiritual traditions. So we project, so we can feel good about ourselves. We can have a narrative. It's hard to be with the groundlessness and the complexity. So if we just have a story about people or what's going on, we can be more regulated. We don't want to tolerate the complexity that it takes to be a counselor, where you don't know, where you're constantly in the phase of understanding. And then through these projections, we miscommunicate, and we can really hurt one another. I'm sure many of you have felt projected upon by partners, and I'm sure you have projected on partners and friends, right? There's a theory that positive projection is we're seeing something positive in others that draws us to them, but then of course over time they don't live up to or completely match our original initial impressions and projections upon them. So in the West, when someone's having a projection, you can get feedback. Someone might interpret it, but not the way I work clinically. We might say, that sounds like your father's voice, or that might be because your brother got all the attention, right? But the goal would be, over time, can you develop this reflective ability to own your projections? I'm thinking, I'm feeling, I'm having these impulses, right? In CBT, they call these cognitive distortions, right? In the cohort, we're projecting on how we see the relationships in the cohort from our past. So in both traditions, and I might even say in all traditions, although I'm not one to go towards this unified one theory of all traditions and knowledge bases, I really like thinking of highlighting the distinctness as opposed to oversimplifying and finding similarities. But generally speaking, humility is needed to acknowledge one's distorted perceptions. Almost maturity, self-strength is needed to notice you are projecting and to acknowledge it and then to work through it and rework them. Constant self-awareness, not just in class, but throughout your life. I often tell my clients that before they walk up a flight of stairs, they ask themselves, what do I want? Or what am I feeling? Or what thoughts am I having? Do I have these thoughts regularly? What memory is coming through my mind? How often do I think of that memory? Why might I think of that memory? You can work through projections by being open to other people's views. You can really work on interrupting habitual patterns, the fresh start, the awakeness, coming back to one's body and breath. And you can try to interact in new ways, right? I haven't covered enactment yet, but basically when someone relates with you, there's an impulse to potentially react in your habitualized way or even potentially in a way that others around this person. But is there a way that you can notice your initial impulse and maybe try acting in a new way? Instead of defensiveness or judgment, maybe empathy, maybe curiosity. Potentially, you could say, I need to take a break. I don't want to talk about this. Whatever would be new for you. This is your time to expand. And as you expand personally in your relational styles, you'll have more flexibility in your counseling skills, in your counseling style to work with diverse people and diverse situations. So, as I said earlier, some differences about projection in Buddhist and Western psychology is Western psychology is very much out of this Eurocentric point of view, really dualistic views, simpler cause and effect, believing in the precision of language, while Buddhism is more focused on impermanence, this idea of no self, this idea of interdependence, right? That people's personal and groups, cultural, karmic are arising in a moment. Often there's clashes even in subgroups in American culture, even within groups that seem similar, that they understand the language and the behavioral norms and the history in different ways. And can we talk about it and understand why we see things differently? Counseling is addressing reducing symptoms of diagnoses, or maybe improving relational skills or communication skills or self-regulation skills, where Buddhism is really focused on kind of liberation. Some pitfalls I can think about is you can over-spiritualize psychological issues or see everything as a spiritual issue where potentially someone is just having a hard time with their anxiety. And it may not be about, it may be partially about, but not completely about groundlessness or loss of meaning, or you can over-psychologicalize spiritual issues and say, oh, they're psychotic and things like that, right? I want to be very careful for you to learning two very distinct traditions. The Western tradition is to find similarities. I would recommend you hold on to the differences potentially. It's really important to not ignore the cultural differences that may be going on even within schools of Buddhism and different understandings. Most likely everyone's behaving in a way with positive intentions, but we might not understand why these people think these are positive intentions. The goal here is in this class not to get, while there'll be lots of theories to draw on and you can think about, and you can reflect on what happened in this class, outside of class, and you can run it through all the theoretical perspectives that you know in the class. Really, it's about being with one another and the relational work of understanding the cohort and creating a meaning and creating cooperation and kind of understanding with more complexity how groups function. And I caution you that as you go through this program, you're going to have so many new insights. And there is a multiple kind of graduate school counseling syndromes, but one is that you feel like you're learning so much, you're gaining new insights that you really can feel like you're superior to other people. And I want to caution you against that. And I could imagine that could come up in this course. How do we address projections in Buddhism? We meditate, we come back to the present moment, we notice our projections, we notice our habitual patterns, we work to cultivate equanimity, which is a state where we can explore things and reflect and contemplate. We approach things with compassion, we observe our own thought patterns, we try to do this without attachment. Now I got it, but you just notice it and move on to the next thought. And maybe in meditation, that the meditations that taught here, that's what you do. Potentially out of meditation, you can also pay attention, notice these things. You can return to the present moment. I highly recommend this when you're finding yourself spiral in this class or in any relational experience, or even with yourself, right? Going back to sense and perceptions, embodied Buddhism. And then you can try to bring this non-dual view, touch into this when you find your narratives really solid. You can notice your projections in real time. You can realize when you're being idealistic versus realistic. I really like this idea of in hard times with effort and persistence. I think of my relationships, my enduring relationships, of the patience, the effort, the persistence, the care, the love, the compassion that everyone has had to have to make them sustain? Can you tolerate things being imperfect? And can you have gratitude for what is? Can you potentially, it might be an advanced teaching, but see the awe, maybe the luminosity of what's around you? How amazing to be alive and to be alive with others in this moment, in this room. So this will really impact recognizing your projections into your clinical work. So you will get out of just understanding your clients and your client's life from your own previous subjective views, right? You'll become more aware of what these are. You'll work with your countertransference. By noticing your projective, you'll be able to develop more intellectual, more emotional, more relational flexibility as opposed to just going down these patterns you've gone down a million times. You'll be able to seek a depth understanding of others. This is the idea partially of body, speech, mind that you'll learn, is that we're not just simplifying things into psychological theories or diagnostic categories, right? You can increase awareness and have more views to draw on when understanding yourself and others. You can really practice your critical thinking skills. This is what I think is going on. What might be the exceptions to that? What am I missing? Is this a personal narrative? Is this a cultural narrative that's been given to me? So building this regulation for contemplation will really help you be with your clients. You'll be able to tolerate their pain and their journey and their pace of change. And I think recognizing one's projections will increase one's humility, one's compassion, potentially increase your options of what to say, how to say it, for your behavior options, how to act and why. I think I've said most of this already. I want to try to get done. So, right, this projective process is also seen as a part of empathy, which I think is important for us to touch on at least, is that when we see others' pains, we can resonate with our own pain, which can be one path towards empathy. I think Dale Asriel has a wonderful article on Shadows and Lights about this. We'll do this with our clients, that we may not have that same experience, potentially something similar. We can use that to arouse empathy for others while also realizing that our experience is different. But this is one of the goals of this path of Buddhism and counselor, that I think the research has said that while it had been given that counselors are empathetic and that's who goes into the field, that's not always been the case, and that empathy is something that can be practiced and trained and improved. And I think that's part of your goal throughout the program and in this class. I guess the biggest things I want to say here is enjoy the process and the growth, right? It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to project. It's okay to misunderstand others. It's okay to not be aware of something in oneself and then gain greater awareness of that in yourself. I put a few questions here that you could be prompts in the class that you could think about, but I imagine, can you share a projection that changed since you entered the program? I thought I was going to be enlightened by the end of the program, and I don't know, maybe upon graduation, I realized the program didn't enlighten me, probably much sooner than that, or I had a view of my cohort as a harmonious glob of oceanic bliss, right, to quote Freud, and it was messy and it was imperfect, right? What projections are you comfortable with and why? And what projections are you hard for you to tolerate? Is it hard for you to tolerate that others may be aggressive or mean or even sadistic? Is it hard for you to tolerate how people miss you, how you miss others, how certain situations cannot be resolved the way you would like? How situations can move a little more towards win-win, but not big win-win. And can you begin to question your own thoughts, or the old Buddhist saying, don't believe everything you think. I hope this is helpful. I think this is a really vital concept in both Buddhist psychology and in counseling skills, to recognize even what our clients are telling us are their narrative that comes out of their karma and their histories of how they're understanding the events in their life. Some of you may go into couples therapy, or may go into family therapy or group therapy or community psychology or organizational interventions, and being able to tolerate that people have projections and to hear the different projections and to find ways for people to talk about how they're experiencing the world and each other is a wonderful skill, and even a wonderful skill in one's life. Okay. Hope this is helpful. Take care. Bye-bye.